Good evening. We welcome you all tonight to virtually talk about a global health threat that will and is changing the way we live. We are not, fortunately, talking about COVID-19, but rather Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Globally, there are 50 million people currently living with dementia. That's one person diagnosed every 3 seconds. In my short pause, we had another diagnosis occur. While right now we are all dealing with a worldwide pandemic, COVID-19, our team of scientists continues to work diligently to find those new treatments for chronic illnesses such as Alzheimer's disease and dementia. These are diseases that impact so many of our family, our friends, and our neighbors. Today's event is meant to engage, educate, and inspire all of you. We want to break down barriers between science and the public, and it is very much our wish to be able to share with you the important science that has been developed and is emerging. We want you to know, if you are a patient or family with this disease, that you are not alone. We are indeed here for you as doctors, nurses, researchers, and institutions such as the University Health Network, the Alzheimer Society. Collectively, we wish to find a cure, but until then, we want to help all live fuller and healthier lives. In a few moments, you'll hear from our keynote speaker, Jay Ingram, a renowned broadcaster and author who has written and spoken extensively about Alzheimer's disease and dementia. After Jay's keynote, we'll have a moderation and a discussion with a question and answer session with our panel of remarkable experts. These include Dr. Donald Weaver, the co-director of the Krembil Brain Institute right here at UHN, Dr. Saskia Sivananthan, Chief Science Officer with the Alzheimer Society of Canada, and Dr. Andrea Iaboni, a geriatric psychiatrist who is also a clinician-scientist and the medical lead of the Specialized Dementia Unit at the KITE Research Institute, the research arm of Toronto Rehabilitation Institute at University Health Network. We're also extremely honored to have Leonard and Naomi Howe with us, who will share their experience of living with dementia. Thank you for sharing your story. Tonight's panel discussion will discover and cover the future of research, including the search for new treatments and what science is telling us about prevention. You'll also hear about the crucial community supports and the new technologies to help those living with dementia and also to help and support their caregivers. It's most important that we'll hear this through the lens of the lived experience of Naomi and Leonard Howe. We have no doubt that this evening will be an exhilarating and dynamic discussion, one which we hope leaves you with a renewed sense of hope for the future. Please now take a moment to watch this video about where we stand in the fight against Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And again, thank you very sincerely for being with us. Thank you.
Living with dementia is like a challenge every day. It's a challenge every night. It's a total strategizing of your movement and how you're going to do it, when you're going to do it. I could read the beginning of a sentence and the middle of a sentence and the end of a sentence, but by the time I got to the end, I'd forgotten what the sentence was about. There hasn't been a night of sleep in the last probably 4 years. It's always up, around, it's relentless, totally relentless, and exhausting because of that.
Dementia is a terrible disease. It's one that really doesn't have a protocol. It crosses all boundaries, which is what makes it so difficult. It's personal, it's emotional, it crosses more than just health, housing, transportation, your ability to work. It's not a typical trajectory. You don't know what to expect. You don't know how it's going to impact you next.
I like to say you meet a family with Alzheimer's because it's not a disease of an individual patient. It's a disease that affects an entire family. And the mother, the father, the person that they know and love is changing as the disease progresses.
Caring for somebody living with dementia is like walking on a road that is always moving. So it's moving under your feet, the direction is moving, and you need to get comfortable with that feeling. So you learn what patience is, you learn what flexibility is, and you kind of get comfortable with not knowing. I think that's what it's like for me.
Dementia is one of the few conditions with the level of crisis that we currently have for which we have no treatments. Our research is hugely underfunded given the scale of the disease. We are currently funding about $5 per person diagnosed with dementia. That is the lowest funding for a disease, period, in Canada. The next closest disease funds more than double per person and has half the impact economically.
A breakthrough in Alzheimer's disease to me would be what's called a disease-modifying drug. A drug which, when you take it, stops the disease in its tracks. My lab is dedicated to designing, developing, and hopefully discovering that cure for Alzheimer's disease.
What gives me hope is hearing the stories from people who are living with dementia, who are honest, who are brave in telling us what they're dealing with, and help us every day to drive forward and start trying to close that gap. They guide our research program. They guide the direction of our advocacy. They guide the programs and services because they tell us what they're dealing with. And they are impatient. They don't have time to wait around for another 15 years before we figure out that this is an issue and start investing in it.
I want to be part of whatever we'll do. It's easy to help when you've got it. You can talk about it. I want to share my story because I want to help others. And I believe that others can be helped. And we'll get there.
I'd like to thank Dr. Kevin Smith, the CEO of UHN, for his introductory remarks. And I certainly hope that you enjoyed that video. It definitely captures the challenges faced by Leonard and Naomi, and indeed all people, all families who are living with dementia. But I think that this video also captures some of the optimism, the hope that researchers and people who work in this area have for the future. Every month, new discoveries are being made. And sooner or later, one of these discoveries is going to lead to a cure. My name is Dr. Donald Weaver, and I am co-director of the Krembil Brain Institute. I am a practicing neurologist, and I see people with dementia, and I'm also a researcher who works in the area of Alzheimer's disease. And I share the optimism for the future, but today, the situation is just a little bit more dire. Currently, there are 500,000 Canadians living with dementia. And this number is increasing. It's increasing a lot every year. Recently, we've heard a lot about COVID and the COVID pandemic. Well, dementia, it's also a pandemic. As we heard from the introductory remarks, there is a new case worldwide every 3 seconds. That's also a pandemic. And because of this, we need to sound the alarm. We need to speak out, not only as researchers and people who care, but as citizens in general. We need to draw people together to address this problem and to try to seek a solution. And getting these conversations going, that's why we brought you together tonight. We want to give you an update on where we stand currently, and we also want to give a glimpse into the future. What's down the road in the area of Alzheimer's disease? How can we help people who have dementia? How can we help their families? How can we erase the stigma that's associated with this and to improve lives in our communities? We have to get people together. We have to break down the silos, and we have to work collectively if we're going to find the much needed solutions that are required. And with these thoughts in mind, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. He's certainly known to many of us. Jay Ingram is an award-winning broadcaster. He's hosted 2 national science programs in Canada, Quirks and Quarks on CBC Radio and Daily Planet on Discovery Channel. He's written 17 books, which are distributed worldwide in more than 15 languages. He's an esteemed member of the Order of Canada. And Jay is also the author of The End of Memory, A Natural History of Aging and Alzheimer's. So clearly this is a topic about which he has put a lot of thought into. And because of this, we're interested in what he has to say. So Jay, welcome.
Thank you very much, Don. I'm very pleased to be here virtually anyway, and I'm looking forward to the panel and the question and answer period after the panel. I'm sure we're all going to get new insights into Alzheimer's disease. My role is to set the stage for what follows, and in my time, I'm going to try and answer 3 questions that, in my experience, are the 3 most asked questions about Alzheimer's disease. And I just do want to make one important point. I'm going to be talking about the science of Alzheimer's, the research efforts to develop what Dr. Weaver described as something that will halt the disease in its tracks. So I'm not going to discuss other really important issues like housing for people with dementia, the impact on caregivers and how best to direct that. So I'm going to stick to these 3, I think, important questions. 1, am I going to get it? 2, what can I do to reduce that risk? And 3, if I do get it, what then? So question 1, am I going to get it? My experience is that people who ask this question are worried from a genetics point of view. They have an aunt who had Alzheimer's disease, and they're concerned that somehow they're going to inherit that predisposition to the disease. It's very important here to split Alzheimer's disease, and I should mention parenthetically, there are several dementias. Alzheimer's probably accounts for 75% of others, but there is Lewy body disease, frontotemporal dementia, vascular dementia, and some of them coexist with Alzheimer's. But I'm going to confine my remarks to Alzheimer's disease. If you look at Alzheimer's, it can be split into 2 kinds: early onset, familial Alzheimer's, and late onset. I want to talk first about early onset because there the genetics is important. Important also to realize early onset Alzheimer's probably accounts for about 1% of the total. However, it's important for the following reason. If you have, say, a parent who gets Alzheimer's in their early 50s, long before 65, say, and it's determined that they carry a mutant gene that actually caused the disease. There are 3 such genes that are well known so far. If they have the gene, then you as a child of that parent run a 50% chance of inheriting the gene itself. What's really critical is that this gene doesn't just alter your risk. If you have the mutant gene, it dictates that you will get Alzheimer's. And the problem, well, the issue for not just the person who has the gene, but also the children who know that they have a 50% chance of inheriting that gene, is the dilemma, should I get tested? If I get tested and I have the gene, I know I will get the disease. If I'm testing and I don't, then I won't get it. But again, this is 1% of all Alzheimer's, and these are really the only cases where having a bad gene actually determines, it dictates that you will get the disease. So for instance, if you had a grandparent who got dementia in their early 50s, but your parents didn't, you're not going to inherit that gene from your grandparents. It will stop at the generation of your parents. So that's early onset. There are genes that dictate you get the disease. Late onset Alzheimer's is by far the majority. It's 98% of all Alzheimer's cases. And here, while there are genes, they don't dictate that you get the disease. They alter your risk. So the best known is a set of 3 genes. Say they come in 3 different flavors. One version actually probably reduces your risk. And again, we're talking about late onset here, 65 and older. Another version of that gene probably is neutral in terms of risk for getting the disease. And the third version of the gene raises your risk. So if you get 2 copies of the worst version, and for instance, my mother had Alzheimer's disease, I don't know, but I might have inherited one bad gene from them, and maybe I inherited a bad gene from my dad, even though he didn't have dementia well into his 90s. So let's say I have 2 bad genes. Is that cause for worry? Well, it does raise my risk. The numbers attached to that seem to vary, but I've seen claims that my risk could be increased as much as tenfold or even a bit more. It's also important to realize, though, that half of the people that inherit 2 bad genes never get Alzheimer's. Also important to realize that a significant percentage of Alzheimer's patients don't have those bad genes. Now, other genes are being discovered all the time by genome sequencing. So what I say today may not be true 2 or 3 years from now. But my point really is, with late onset Alzheimer's, if your parent, one parent or both of your parents had it when they were quite late in life, that may raise your risk, but that doesn't mean that you're actually going to get it. So most of the time, I reassure people who have some relative with Alzheimer's by saying, you know, if you look at the numbers and you look at the statistics, the chance that you're going to, quote unquote, inherit it is probably pretty small. So that's the answer to question 1. Will I get it? Question 2. What can I do to change my odds? This is a burgeoning and really interesting area of research. And I'm going to rely here on something called the Lancet Commission. The medical journal, The Lancet, one of the most prominent medical journals in the world, has convened commissions to look specifically, intensively at different diseases. They struck the Alzheimer's Commission in 2017, issued a report, and they've now just issued their second report. And I'm going to take the data for this question, what can I do to lessen my risk, from that commission. So if we can have the first slide, I'll just show you what this looks like. And please don't worry about reading all this print. These slides are going to be on the website anyway. Plus, I'm going to zoom in to each period in that life that stretches from left to right, early, midlife, and late life. But as you can see, there are a number of risks, many of which we can do something about. So let's look at early life. And here, first of all, you'll probably be struck by the idea that something in early life can determine, at least partially, whether I get dementia at the age of 75 or 80. Yes, it's true. It's one of the most striking things about Alzheimer's dementia. And here, according to the Lancet Commission, education plays a key role. They give it a number of 7% of your total risk. Depends on how thorough your early education was. I think they set the figure at finishing grade 12. Other data has suggested the further you go in school, the less your risk of Alzheimer's. Now, 7% is a significant number, as you're about to see. However, if you're my age, you know, my grade 12 years are far, far in the distant past. And so far, the jury is out as to whether trying to recover that, let's say I went back and took online courses or did Sudoku puzzles every day, did the New York Times crossword. The jury is still out as to how significant an impact they can be. So my advice to people who feel like I do, that my education is in my past, if you have grandchildren, do whatever you can to ensure they get a good education, and then you'll be protecting them. Let's move now to midlife, and the number of potential risks increases. Obesity, 1%. Alcohol, which was just added by the Lancet Commission this year. The alcohol number they quote there is, pretty significant. It'd be like 2 decent-sized glasses of wine every day. I don't drink that much, so that seems like a lot, but I'm sure a lot of people have taken in the idea that red wine is good for you and do that thinking that they're going to be better. But according to the experts, 1% risk for dementia is that kind of alcohol consumption. Hypertension, blood pressure, 2%, very important in midlife. Again, we're talking long before the symptoms of Alzheimer's might appear. 2% of your risk. Traumatic brain injury, another factor introduced just this year by the Commission. 3% of your risk. Again, when it's in your past, it's a little difficult to think about how you can cope with that. And here's one that is very important for me because I do have hearing loss. 8% of my risk for Alzheimer's is allocated to hearing loss. Now, there is some relatively new evidence suggesting that if you wear hearing aids, as I do, that risk is mitigated. It's a very interesting scientific problem, though, because there are two possibilities. Maybe the earliest signs of Alzheimer's involve hearing loss, or the other way around. Hearing loss creates social isolation, which in turn might raise your risk of Alzheimer's disease. So again, if I had a recommendation as a non-expert but an enthusiastic observer, I would say if you have hearing loss, get your hearing checked, get hearing aids. And finally, late life. And there's a stack of risks here, some of which, again, you can do something about, some of which you can't. If you have diabetes, even though you're being treated with insulin and you're doing okay, it's still a 1% risk. Air pollution, the third new factor added by the Lancet Commission, 2% risk. There was an interesting experiment in Ontario that demonstrated that people living 50 meters from a freeway with all of the involved air particulates that has, were 12% more likely to develop Alzheimer's than people living not 50 meters away, but 200 meters away. Physical inactivity, that's been often said. The Ontario Brain Institute a few years ago said the one thing that they could say definitively about trying to stave off dementia was stay active. Social isolation, I mentioned that with respect to hearing loss, 4%. That's super important. And Dr. Weaver had an article in the paper today relating the shut-in conditions imposed by COVID to Alzheimer's disease. Depression, also 4%, often confused with Alzheimer's, sometimes driven by Alzheimer's, possibly depression drives Alzheimer's in turn, but a significant risk. And finally, 5% of risk for smoking. Well, I mean, if we haven't taken in the message yet that smoking is bad for you, here's just another reason. But look at those late life issues, 3, 5, 9, 13, 18% of your total risk for Alzheimer's are things in late life that in many cases you can do something about. I took the total because the total is 40%, as you see there on the right side of the graph, potentially modifiable risk. Well, some of those things you may not be able to do anything about, but 25% of your risk you can do something about. And that is very significant. That may and probably exceeds any genetic risk you might have. Thing is, as is shown by 2 commission reports 3 years apart with 3 new risks, there could be others. Sleep, increasing evidence right now that bad, non-healthful sleep may contribute, or again, it may be part of the early symptoms. Gum disease has been pointed to. Even the microbiome, the microbial population in our guts. People with some studies, recent studies have shown that Alzheimer's is associated with a different combination of microorganisms. Again, we don't know which is the cause and which is the result. And finally, the last question. What do I do if I do get it? What then? And here, and Dr. Weaver alluded to it, we're not in a very good space right now. If you look at all the drugs that have gone through clinical trials, probably since the year 2000, really none of them have turned out to be as effective as we'd like. And it's causing a reaction in the research community. And this conundrum goes back to 1906. So next slide. Alois Alzheimer himself was both a neurologist. He met and talked to patients, but he was also an expert microscopist. His first patient was a 51-year-old woman who came to him already with dementia, died 5 years later, so she had early onset. But he stayed in touch with her, and when she died, he prepared slides of her brain tissue to examine, and this is one of those slides. Now, I don't expect anybody really to be able to make sense of a 1906 slide, but there were a couple of odd features in this brain tissue that Alzheimer pointed to. One were lumps of dark deposits, as highlighted in this slide. He called those plaques. They shouldn't be there. But he also noticed other deposits, teardrop-shaped or flame-shaped, that he called tangles. And those are the tangles. That's 1906. Today, in 2020, the vast majority of drugs that we have tried to test to treat Alzheimer's have targeted those plaques and tangles, especially the plaques. And as I said, those drugs have not worked very well. Some of them actually did do what they were supposed to do, reduce the amount of plaque-like material in a brain, but didn't halt the dementia as it developed, as the cognitive decline continued. So now there's a lot of discussion in the Alzheimer's research world. Are plaques and tangles the wrong target? They seem very closely implicated in most of the stages of development of Alzheimer's, so I don't think anybody is throwing them out completely. But there are questions now. Is inflammation a significant issue? Could a virus even be involved? Are there other potential causes? So, while this may seem a little bit disappointing that, we don't exactly know, are we chasing the right target? I do think that it's really important and really good for the research world that we're now taking perhaps a slightly broader view. One of the things that I should have mentioned in when I was talking about early onset is one of the things that people criticize or comment on about the attempts to develop a drug is that, well, we're just not giving the drug early enough. Because when symptoms of Alzheimer's first appear, it's pretty clear now that the disease has been incubating in that person for as much as 20 years. But you cannot give a drug ethically to somebody who's not yet showing any symptoms. However, people who have inherited the gene for early onset Alzheimer's, we know they're going to get the disease. And if they agree, clinical trials of drugs can be given to them much earlier than symptoms appear because we know they're going to get the symptoms. And some of those trials are ongoing right now. They might resolve this issue as to whether plaques or tangles are the things that we should be targeting. So those are my brief comments on the three most important questions, or the three most usually asked questions about Alzheimer's. And when we get to the panel, we will be able to deal much more deeply, not just in the science, but also in those areas that I mentioned I wouldn't be talking about. Role of caregivers, the role of setting up an environment that's more suitable for Alzheimer's patients, and other issues, I'm sure. Now, caregivers, I understand that they are the unsung heroes. I watched my father when he was 95 years old, going to a nursing home every day and hoping to see a transitory smile on my mother's face. And if he did, going home feeling that that was a good day. It was heartbreaking. So I know about that, but we are now going to hear firsthand what it's like to live with dementia through the eyes of a woman who bravely has agreed to share her story, Naomi and Leonard Howe.
I've reached the goals that are always too high for me. Leonard and I have been together for over 35 years. Leonard is my true love. We've been through a lot together. I would say, even though Leonard was diagnosed at the end of 2016, I was noticing things for at least 3 years, maybe 5 years before that. Some of the things that I was noticing about Leonard were a little bit obscure. You know, they would be things like we would have something planned to go out for an evening, and it would be he just would not remember at all. So I would interpret that as all good wives do, that he just wasn't being thoughtful. And that it wasn't important to him. There was something really odd about it because Leonard was a professional and a senior leader in the community, and it seemed like things were slipping. One of the other things I was noticing was that he was really acting out his dreams at night and kind of sometimes falling out of bed, sometimes accidentally hitting me. And I remember asking him to talk to his doctor about that at his next checkup, and you know, he would forget different things. So there were a lot of things that weren't connected. They seemed very random, but they started to add up. Yeah.
Doesn't it smell good?
Sometimes people will say, if they're living with somebody with dementia, I'm watching them disappear, or I'm watching everything they are go away. That's not my experience at all. I'm watching it change, but you know, Leonard will always be a poet. He will always be one of the few good men with real heart and that empathy and that kindness and all the things that I fell in love with initially, I'm still in love with now. But it's different. Yeah, it's different. What I can tell other people who may be experiencing a little bit of what I'm going through is that love never goes away. And you know that expression, love is love is love? It really is true. It alters, it changes its form, but I mean, that happens in life anyway. So I think with dementia, it's an added component of it, but if you are connected, you're still going to be that way.
Thank you,
Madame.
Beauty.
I think it's important for me to share my story because we can right now. Leonard is in early stage dementia, and he's very self-reflective. And so what a great opportunity to be able to communicate to people about what that experience is like. And I just want to stand beside him. And if there's any way that I can help, you know, I want to be there for that.
Thank you, Naomi and Leonard, for being so forthright about your lives together. We really appreciate that. We will hear more from Naomi and Leonard in just a moment. But first, tonight's panel. Dr. Donald Weaver is co-director of the Krembil Brain Institute. We've met him already. He's a neurologist who went back to school to become a medicinal chemist in the hopes of one day creating a drug, as he said, that can stop Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Saskia Sivananthan is Chief Research and Knowledge Translation and Exchange Officer with the Alzheimer Society of Canada. She is a scientist and public speaker, and Dr. Sivananthan has studied the societal impacts of Alzheimer's and dementia here in Canada, but also around the world. And Dr. Andrea Iaboni is a geriatric psychiatrist and clinician-scientist at KITE, the research arm of the Toronto Rehab Institute at the University Health Network. Dr. Iaboni is the medical lead of the specialized dementia unit, a unit at Toronto Rehab that admits older adults with behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And we have some questions that we would like to direct to all of you, but I'm going to start with you, Dr. Sivananthan, and the stigma surrounding Alzheimer's disease. According to your research, 1 in 4 Canadians say they'd be embarrassed or ashamed if diagnosed. They might even choose not to disclose it. Why is that?
That's a great question, Jay. I'd say for the Alzheimer's Society, fighting stigma is our biggest battle because it's a challenge to everything we do to support people living with dementia. And you often wonder why, because how can stigma be the biggest issue? But if you take a step back and really think about what is stigma, it's a stereotype, it's a negative one. But what makes it the biggest battle, I would say, is the resulting behavior of that stereotype, the discrimination. And that goes right back to the point that you made. Stigma is the reason why Canadians are afraid to talk about dementia. We did a nationwide survey a few years ago, and almost half of Canadians would be afraid to tell a family member if they were diagnosed with dementia. And that number goes up even higher. Almost 80% wouldn't tell a friend or an acquaintance. And I'd say stigma is the reason why Canadians wait so long before they even go in to get a diagnosis and get the help that they need. We know from the research studies that Canadians often wait until it's almost the moderate stage of dementia before they'll go in to see their family doctors. And then even after that diagnosis, they often wait a year or more before they reach out to the Alzheimer Society to get some of the supports that they need. And I mean, if I need to drive this point home any further, I'd say stigma is the reason why dementia research isn't funded to the scale that it should be as well. I think that research funders haven't yet faced the impact of dementia. Yes, we know over 500,000 Canadians are living with dementia, and that number will double in less than 10 years. But in actual fact, 1 in 2 Canadians are actually touched by dementia, either living with it, caring for it, or they know someone with it. But we don't still fund the disease to the scale that it should. But really, I'd say the real experts in this are Leonard and Naomi, who are living with dementia and who could really speak from their lived experience. So I would turn it to them. Leonard and Naomi, what would you say your experience has been with stigma after Leonard's diagnosis?
I mean, one of the things that Leonard and I talk about a lot is the fact that this thing is invisible, especially in the beginning. And so there's a long path between that day of diagnosis and late stage dementia, where somebody is really thinking about full-time care, long-term care facility, and that kind of thing. And like everybody else, we didn't know. We don't know. And you get that diagnosis, and it's so shocking, because who is more afraid of anything than dementia? We don't want to hear that word. And there are other invisible conditions in the world. We know that. We know that people with addiction, or if you can have a lot of things that don't show on the outside. But there is something about dementia that really strikes fear in the heart of just about everybody, because we don't talk about it. And that's one of the reasons why Leonard and I are here, because everybody knows somebody, has a grandmother, a great-grandfather, a cousin, somebody, but who is talking about what it's really like and really answering questions transparently about what it's like to live with dementia. So I think that's something that is really important.
Mm-hmm. It's incredible. I'm truly moved by the comments, the diagnosis, the comments of people tonight just around this issue and around this disease. Because I have to tell you, I was a little bit kind of, by the way, I will stop talking once in a while and go, what were we talking about? So I just want to park that over there and tell you that I'm one of those guys, And actually, it kind of helps. People will begin a conversation, realize, and drop right out of it, and shift. It will shift to a kind of a different way of expressing themselves, because they know they're dealing with something. They don't know what to do about it. They're not necessarily frustrated or anything. It's just new. It's just a different step. And what was I talking about? Stigma.
I wonder, can I add to the comments from Naomi and Leonard? So as a psychiatrist, so I want to add also to what Saskia was saying. I think about it not only as an effect at a societal level, but the effect on the individual and their mental health of stigma. Certainly, the way that our society thinks about dementia affects how we how people with dementia think about themselves and when they're diagnosed, and these sort of negative societal views can lead to some low self-esteem, loss of self-worth, feelings of helplessness, can lead to anxiety. People can feel ashamed and worthless, and all of this will increase your isolation. If you're feeling like this, you're not getting out and connecting with people because you don't feel great about yourself and your diagnosis. And if you're feeling hopeless, you don't feel like you have a lot of options, and then it avoids seeking help, the help that you need to maintain the highest quality of life. And so stigma is a big problem for individuals, and something they have to sort of challenge within themselves to be able to sort of achieve the best possible life with dementia.
A good point.
It almost creates a kind of self-stigma. The other thing is we revere top-notch cognitive functioning. We really do. We don't want to miss a beat. And a lot of people with dementia are younger. It's not early onset, but it's in a time of your life where you're not thinking about even necessarily retiring, let alone. And so when you notice that kind of ability, not the same, it can be kind of scary. And it can be scary as a couple. Not in Kansas anymore.
I was going to add to that. It's a good point that you just made, Naomi, because I also often think people think of dementia as an old person's disease. And so it's easy to just park away and not worry about it. And Jay just pointed out all the different risk factors and things that you can do to modify your risk. And you can develop dementia, at a stage when you least expect it to. But I'm sorry, I cut you off, Leonard. Please go ahead.
That was a great presentation and great information coming forward. I was stunned by it, and I can't wait to get it in a slower context, in a slower environment. To tell you the truth, I didn't have much issue with stigma. First of all, I'd never heard it before. I didn't know what it meant. So just walking around suffering stigma, I'm not even sure that I had that experience. But let's say that I did. You're allowed to swear a lot more when you have dementia.
Don't you think?
You can just throw it right on the floor. It doesn't really matter. Nobody cares about that either.
And actually, Leonard's a really good example of just. Go ahead.
I have to interrupt you. See how quick. It's really quick. And you know what? This is my my gunslinger metaphor, is that I write a lot and I've got a number of poems around, in my case, Lewy body, under as a gunslinger thing, just a kind of looking around, quiet, just made a fast draw in the Wild West or something. And it's really corny. I know it's really corny, but I don't know. It's one thing that I get that I can attach to, and it sticks for a while, because nothing much sticks once you've got it. But that's one of the things it does. But I still didn't get back to what I started talking about. Damn.
I wonder. I think you were in a way talking about how you didn't have a lot of stereotypes yourself about the way in which
me as a person, as it were, the
it'll come back.
I have a sense of humor that I cultivate. One of these days, I'm going to have a stand-up kind of comedian thing around stepple, but we'll see. Anyway, that it's
is it okay, Leonard, if I jump in about stereotypes? Because I'm really interested in that idea that that some people have a lot of negative stereotypes about what it might be to have dementia, and other people might not. And not having those stereotypes means that you can do things your own way. You don't feel like you're having to follow any path. And I think that's really important, because a lot of the stereotypes about dementia are often really oversimplified, or they're exaggerated, or they're inaccurate. And they really focus on the end stages of the disease and not the whole journey. And you know, there's no one single way to have dementia, because everyone's brain is different, everyone's life experience is different, and everyone's sort of social situation is different. So everyone, of course, has their own journey. And the other one, Jay mentioned earlier, the idea of reassuring people who had a relative with Alzheimer's. Of course, your father or your mother's journey with Alzheimer's would be very different than yours, because they're, you know, we don't do anything like our parents do. And, you know, life was very different 30 years ago. Yeah. And so we can't even really use their journey as an example for how our journey might be. And so that's why, you know, really challenging these assumptions about what dementia will look like is so important.
You know, it actually sometimes just comes down to simple things like language. I have a friend in Alberta who has dementia, and it irritates him when people describe him as suffering from dementia. He says, I'm living with dementia. Now, that's a small change, but when you think about how in Canada, our language around many issues, racism, diversity, you could go on, is changing, is being forced to change, to be more accommodating. I could see the language around dementia, that would be one, it's maybe a small thing, but changing that will be part of the better understanding of the condition. We have many, many topics to cover, so with everyone's acquiescence, I'd like to move on. We all know, everybody watching this knows that we're dealing with a global pandemic. And Dawn Weaver, I referred earlier to the fact that you had an essay in the paper today looking at the connection between COVID or shutdown, isolation-induced depression, and on that a little bit, please.
Certainly. You know, when you were going through the various risk factors, you pointed out that social engagement is important, and certainly for individuals who are experiencing dementia, keeping active mentally, keeping active physically is important to their well-being. And what we've experienced with lockdown is exactly the opposite to both of those. People are isolated socially, they are isolated so that they're not going out as much as they used to. And this is also, of course, adding to depression. And so if we, you know, this is a real confluence of negative factors all coming together to make life worse for these individuals, and probably leading to disease progression. So this, you know, it's a pair of pandemics. And we put in depression as well. These really are coming together in a very negative way and synergistically adding to each other to make things worse. And you know, I think we have to, when we look at long-term care facilities, you know, that is a very difficult issue because certainly across Canada we've had the COVID go through multiple long-term care facilities in a devastating way. And the end result has been to really enforce severe lockdowns there. But then the other measure has been that these people have been suffering significantly, the cognitively impaired people, because of the consequences of the lockdown. And so this is a knife that cuts in two ways. It's a sharp edge that we're on. And, you know, I think that as we face a second wave and as things get worse in the coming months, we're really going to have to think about balancing all the factors in order to consider people who have dementia, who have cognitive impairments, living under strenuous circumstances.
If I could jump in there, Dawn, I couldn't agree with you more. I think during the first wave, Canadians were so focused on keeping people safe, especially in long-term care. So we were focused on protecting, you know, isolating so that people wouldn't die from COVID-19. And we know now that, you know, people living with dementia are at higher risk of developing and potentially dying of COVID too. And at the time when these extreme regulations were put into place, the policymakers didn't stop to think about that impact, about the isolation, what it would have, the other impact, the mental health. And we're also hearing that it's actually caused some of the cognitive decline to potentially progress even faster because of that level of isolation. And so it really brings to mind, with a potential second wave, that we've got to rethink that particular piece in terms of how those regulations are put in place, and especially that family members and loved ones need to have access, because they provide a lot of that social connectedness, the emotional connectedness that we know is so important to supporting people living with dementia.
Dr. Iaboni?
Answer. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So I've been really involved in this work throughout the pandemic, been very acutely aware of the mental health effects of the lockdown on residents in long-term care, and also people with dementia living in the community. I work in both settings. And so I've been working on a project where we've developed something called the Dementia Isolation Toolkit, which is really about helping to find ways to support people while they're within isolation. And that starts with helping to find ways to explain to people who may be having cognitive impairment what's going on, why they're being asked to give up some of these activities that they love, why their routine is being so dramatically changed, why people are wearing all these funny masks, and then goes beyond that to how we can give people the social connection that they need to support their mental health. We did a big review of the literature, the evidence, the scientific evidence around social connection in long-term care, and there's no question that social connection is related to depression, to anxiety, to behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, to suicidal ideation in people who live in those settings. So there's obviously a real drive and push right now for us to find ways to support people with dementia during this period of time, and support their caregivers as well. And in the community, life isn't always easy. A lot of the supports that people had and relied on have changed. They're not the same, and so that's obviously really important.
Can you see some ways, Dr. Iaboni, where when we emerge from COVID, we will develop or will have developed better tools for supporting people with dementia?
I certainly hope that we will have developed new protocols around infection control and prevention that incorporate this idea that we can't indefinitely lock people down in their rooms, that we will have created new interventions or technologies that allow us to bring social connection and activity into people who are needing to be isolated for any period of time. And I hope it goes even to like the built environment and the ways in which our lives are structured. Can we build homes and long-term care homes that are better equipped to allow people to interact with each other in a way that minimizes the risk of transmission of infection. So I think I'm hoping that we're all thinking about this now when we're proposing solutions, but I think these changes are going to slowly evolve over this course of this pandemic. But there's no question that at the moment people are facing this indefinite period of lockdown, and while we've all adapted, people who have cognitive impairment have fewer tools to be able to adapt, and so we have to help them adapt. We have to adapt ourselves to them and their situation.
I mean, one of the most heartbreaking kinds of photo that we've seen during COVID is a family member trying to visit a parent or a grandparent through a window.
Yeah.
And I mean, I bet you in 15 years when we look back, those are going to be some of the photographs that remind us of how bad this has been. Dr. Weaver, if I could just come back to you. I did touch on genetics in answering the question, will I get it? Would you like to expand on the genetics angle of this?
Sure. So, it's a very complicated issue, and as you point out, it's a common question, and certainly it's a question that I get a lot. The majority of dementia, the majority of Alzheimer's disease is what we call sporadic. It happens. And in terms of, types that are inherited, they probably are significantly under 5%. Also, as you pointed out in your presentation, there's a number of genes. There's probably more than 20 genes now that have been implicated in increasing the risk for Alzheimer's disease. But the certainly in the early onset one, the big three, presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and amyloid precursor peptide, those are the, the ones which really are bad news genes in terms of increasing, determining that a person's going to get it. Now, the majority, of course, of Alzheimer's is late onset. And here, the main risk gene that you were referring to, ApoE, comes in 3 flavors, 2, 3, and 4. And 4 is the one which tends to increase the risk, as you had mentioned. You know, I'd like to think that a couple of years from now, maybe in the future, we'll recognize that Alzheimer's, it should be Alzheimer's diseases or Alzheimer's syndrome. And, you know, I think that today we just don't have the diagnostic ability to separate out maybe the multiple diseases that we are currently lumping in together as Alzheimer's. And I sincerely hope that due to genetics and due to increased molecular level understanding of the disease, we'll be able to get beyond between saying there's early onset Alzheimer's disease and late onset Alzheimer's disease, and really break it down into different types of it, because that's going to be absolutely important if we're going to get the right drugs. I don't think there's going to be a pill for every ill when it comes to dementia. And I think we're going to have to reach a point where we accept the fact that there are different types of dementia. You've pointed out there's 2 proteins that aggregate, one's beta amyloid and one's tau, but there's also the involvement of inflammation. And, you know, if you look at that, there are diseases targeting, or sorry, there are drugs targeting amyloid, there's drugs targeting tau, and there's drugs targeting inflammation. But if there's different types or subtypes of Alzheimer's disease, we may have to have specific drugs for those sorts of individuals. And getting a better handle on the genetics as we go forward is going to be, I think, absolutely crucial into coming up with drugs that are infinitely better. I like to compare it to high blood pressure. Mechanistically, high blood pressure is trivial compared to Alzheimer's disease. But no one expects one pill. No one says, you've got high blood pressure, here's the pill, take it and it'll go away. No. I mean, we have a wide range of different medications for high blood pressure, and we throw in, expect people to change their behavior, to eat less salt, to exercise more, etc. So, you know, why should we expect that we're going to get the magic bullet for Alzheimer's disease? Yeah, I think we're going to end up with a whole bunch of bullets, and we're going to have to figure out which subtype of disease to aim it at. And we may have to include some lifestyle modifications to go along with those.
Those are important points, especially, and something we haven't really talked about is that if in the future some combination of medications doesn't cure Alzheimer's or the other dementias, but extends life 5, 7, 8 years.
That's huge.
Yeah, that's not only is that a better life for everyone with dementia, but it eases the pressure on the healthcare system dramatically. I'd like to talk a little bit about lived experience, but I want to start with Naomi and Leonard with this, and then the rest of you panelists can join in. Why would you say, Naomi and Leonard, it's so important to include experiences like yours in dementia research? What might scientists be missing out on if they don't take that, your life and others, into account?
I mean, from my perspective, I just think sometimes we're not asking the right questions because we're not talking to people who are living their own unique situation. I think Dr. Weaver mentioned about how it's so unique to the individual and the family and the type of dementia. Lewy body dementia is something I didn't know anything about a number of years ago. I didn't know that misperceptions and hallucinations and delusions would be a way bigger deal than memory. And so when we're talking to friends and family and we're trying to describe what it's like for Leonard to live with his day-to-day, there's sort of a real disconnect. Well, what are you talking about? Like he lost his keys, right? Go ahead.
I mean, it's kind of trivial, but while we've been talking, there's been three other bodies, persons, hallucinations in this room with us that, lucky for them, I've overlooked.
Lucky for all of us.
But
but
that's just a small little thing, but it's there. It carries on. It does all sorts of tricks.
So a lot of what we're talking about tonight are things like
if I were 85 or 90 or 95, that kind of thing would really, really bother me. It would really set me back in my tracks. Sorry.
No, it's good.
I just remembered that.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we're talking about extending lives and also the quality of life. It's not just about you've got more years or more months or more days on the planet, but what is the quality of your life? And so there's that idea of cure, but there's also that idea of care. And how do we care for ourselves and care for each other in a community when we've got this degree of burgeoning baby boomer dementia that's taking place, and we're really not equipped. We really aren't sort of all talking together about it. So it's not that we have this sense that people need to talk to us necessarily. There are so many people out there, living this every day who have, I think, something to share. And I think our curiosity is what's going to help us get there.
If I can jump in, Jay. Naomi, that last point was really helpful because you mentioned, and we've talked a lot about, a treatment or a cocktail of treatments and cure. But there's a lot of research and more that needs to be done on the quality of life, of care, of living with dementia now. A lot of the programs and services we have right now are based on that research. And we need to fund more of it. We don't often think or talk about it. I mean, I know the Alzheimer Society research program really focuses on that as one of the aspects in particular that we fund. But one of the key learnings for me when I first joined the Alzheimer Society is that we have people living with dementia and caregivers at the table with us when we're discussing the research proposals. And it's amazing to watch the researchers in the room who are hearing those conversations and seeing the reactions and responses from people with lived experience to those proposals, because often they don't think about how does this impact the person? Is it really relevant to what they're living or what they might be living with later down the line? So it's really a mutual learning process. And that's been something I've learned being at the Alzheimer Society and getting to work with people like yourselves, Leonard and Naomi, and others who are living with dementia. It's been truly informative. And it's the reason why we've sort of reshaped our own research program has been based on hearing from lived experience like you driving those priorities for us.
Andrea, do you have a comment?
Well, I mean, all I'll add is that in my experience that, my research has really only been improved by interactions with people living with dementia and their families, because I think that as researchers and as doctors, it's hard because we often have a deficit focus, is what I say. We think about the problems and we think about the symptoms and all of these things, but that what people living with dementia bring is really a focus on problem solving and on their strengths and how an adaptation and learning to thrive while living with dementia. And I think that too much of our research is really focused on the negative side of things. And so I think that absolutely involving people from a very early stage is essential.
Dawn, as Saskia suggested, it sounds to me like your future of multiple medications to deal with the variety would be the perfect way to incorporate lived experience, because that reflects the variety of the dementias that are out there.
Yes, certainly. As I mentioned, there's not going to be a magic pill. And I think that we will have to tailor our approaches on an individual basis. So being a medicinal chemist, being a person who makes molecules, we've traditionally talked about bench to bedside. Well, it's also time to go bedside to bench. it's important to look at what the individuals who are experiencing dementia need to improve their lives, and to take those lessons back to the lab in order to better incorporate our drug design and how we move forward in future.
Thank you. Now, we're at the point in this event where we are going to take questions from the audience, but I have to confess, I see no questions, and somebody behind the scenes could possibly please advise me as to where I might find those questions. In the meantime, I would actually address a question to the panel, but also maybe to Naomi and Leonard, and that is, we've discussed a huge amount of information tonight, and I was probably the most guilty of that. But it's very important to create messages that resonate with an audience, and overloading any audience, especially people who are very anxious to get new information. You can't overload them. So, and I guess, Saskia, this might be mostly to you. Do we have to be careful about, I mean, the research is covering such a broad area right now. Do we have to be careful about the messages we send and not trying to either mislead people or overload them with information?
You know, it's a question that I get every day, Jay, so it's a good one that you asked. Part of my role in knowledge transfer and exchange, what it really means is a two-way communication. It's not just putting the education out there, but also hearing back and learning from your audience. Did that address your question? Was that too much information? Is there more that you need or less? And one of the things I would say is that with dementia, again, not to bring it back to it, but I'm going to, with stigma, because we don't have people talking enough, Canadians aren't talking enough about what their experience is living with it. People are often desperate, so they'll look everywhere and anywhere for information. And so there's a real concern about misinformation, not knowing how to interpret whether the information they're reading is accurate from a valid source. And, you know, should you try it out or should you not? And so I'd say panels like this, even though we did talk about quite a large spectrum of the research, it's all grounded in evidence that all of the panelists are aware of. And I think it's a huge and important source of information. Granted, it'd be great if we could layer it a little bit more, but given the time and the fact that it's virtual, we'll give what we can.
Yes, and we could encourage people to be very careful about watching YouTube videos that claim to cure dementia. We do have some questions from the audience, and I will, I think I'll leave this open to anybody, but perhaps Dawn and Andrea are kind of in, well, who knows? Let me just ask it. How can I prevent or slow the progression of this disease?
Andrea, I look forward to your comments on that.
I feel like Jay's covered, you know, we've talked a bit about what we know contributes to risk and some of the things that we can do. There's certainly anything that's about social activity, physical activity, mental activity, all of those things are really important. The evidence is, is there that these things are valuable, but there's no magic solution for any one of those things. There's no single thing. It's not like knitting is going to fix it, or paying a big fee for an expensive computer game. And so all of those things are important. Attending to your mental health, attending to the relationships in your life, I think are really important. And then I guess more from a biological perspective, I might hand that over to you, Dr. Weaver.
I call my waiting room Sudoku Central. When I go out, there's usually a whole group of people, and they're all sitting there diligently doing Sudokus. And one patient commented to me, he said, "I've got really good at doing these, nothing else, but I'm really good at doing these." In Jay's remarks, he mentioned the article from the August 8th edition of the Lancet, which listed all the risk factors. And I mean, who knows if once you're symptomatic, if modifying these risk factors is going to do anything, but it's certainly not going to hurt. And I think it's certainly worth the effort. So, I tell all my patients to keep physically active, to keep mentally active, to keep socially active, and to pursue that as much as they can. And that's the best that we have. We certainly don't have any medications that work. Um, the Dr. Google provides answers to a lot of people that they get from questionable sources, and I'm always dismayed at what I see people swallowing in a desperate attempt to ward off. But there is no medication that's been shown to do anything, and right now, minimizing your risk factors is still the best route that we've got.
Following on to that comment, Dawn, the next question is, why have there been so many failures in clinical trials?
I don't, yes, they are failures, but I tend to look at them as opportunities to learn. The brain is complicated. And what is the best avenue to go down in coming up with a cure for Alzheimer's disease? There's lots of roads that we can go down, and the failures close off yet another road. And because of that, we are learning the direction to go in. So, you had mentioned about protein misfolding of amyloid and how all the drugs had failed. Well, if we talk about amyloid, if you have one single amyloid peptide by itself, it's not that toxic. You get 2 or 3 together, they become toxic, start destroying brain. But once they become a plaque, they're probably not toxic anymore. So early attempts to clear out all the plaques probably wasn't doing that much because the plaques aren't toxic anymore. And so new approaches at looking at amyloid are looking at the smaller aggregates. So every time, this is a very complicated disorder. And every time we fail, we also learn. And because we are learning, that is why we will enable us to close in on some useful medications in future. But it's the complexity of the disease is why we've had, so many hurdles that we've had to stumble over the course of the last 20, 25 years.
And on that point, that by the time you've reduced the amount of plaque, it's too late because whatever destruction or damage it caused was earlier. We go back to the early onset people who are in drug trials. And these individuals, may get first symptoms when they're in their late 40s, but there's pretty good evidence that plaque and tangles are building up in their brains 20 years earlier.
Yes.
20 years. And, I think, these are small and somewhat special clinical trials. Nonetheless, if evidence emerges from them that treating early is effective, and at the same time, there's a lot of effort in developing tracers so that we can know before symptoms whether these things are collecting in the brain, then you can sort of see a confluence here of efforts that might turn into something useful. We have many more questions, though, so I'd like to move on. And Naomi and Leonard, I'll address this to you first, but I'm sure Saskia and Andrea would like to say something too. What are we learning about the experience of people living with young onset dementia and the different types of support they may need? And in brackets, to give examples of that, children at home, navigating work, balancing their own caregiving responsibilities.
Yeah, technically, I would call Leonard's diagnosis an earlier onset, not early onset in the way that we've been describing. And I think that mushy distinction between what's sort of early and then late onset is becoming more the way it is. The 60 is the new 50 is the new 70 is the new 60, all of that. And it really is true that, certainly for us, I'm working full time. I have a private practice as well. I have a full-time responsibility as Leonard's care partner now. And our discussions around what retirement might look like or what we might do and our living arrangement, all of that is completely in flux, none of which we necessarily anticipated. So, when I do my research and check out Dr. Google for support around this, there's not a lot there. for us. So I'm sure that's also the case for folks that are specifically early onset, about how do you navigate this, because it's just not what we imagined. And again, it comes back to that social understanding of what it means to be diagnosed with dementia at a certain age, and what's happening so much now as we get older, but aren't necessarily frail in that way. I mean, Leonard has always been physically fit, no high blood pressure, we eat really well, meditate every day, all of that. So, we kind of can go through those risk factors and go, I mean, darn, I wish we could find something. So we can't. But in the meantime, we are trying to live our best life. And doing that, yeah.
How do you deal with what you described as things being in flux, where the future may not be, I mean, nobody knows their future,
right,
but you at least have an idea, whereas your ideas have been changed?
That's such a good question. I think we try not to make any knee-jerk reactions too quick. So, but at the same time, I want Leonard to be part of discussions and decisions while he has the facility to do that. So you have to have a lot of difficult discussions. And, we know that we should all be having those discussions anyway. But when you get this kind of a diagnosis, it's like, we should discuss this now. And you really get more serious about it. And for me, and I think we've talked about this, the fear is greatly reduced when you actually face what you don't know exactly what it's going to be like, but you know that this is an incurable disease. You know that it is progressive. So it's probably healthier to try to anticipate and see what you might be able to put in place so that you have as much choice within that as possible, around what that's going to look like, and sort of do that together. I mean, that's really, that's the advantage. And I know not everybody has this as an advantage. We are fortunate that way. We have each other. And so Leonard's not alone and I'm not alone. But, and the Alzheimer Society is actually wonderful. They provide tremendous guidance on options and what that might look like. But it's very individual, and some of the things that we would like on our wish list actually aren't even available in Canada. So, you start to, this is the nature of evolution of what that means as we move forward, right?
I'm reminded of a phrase in the Mr. Rogers movie, mention it, then you can manage it.
Yeah.
And that has come up in different ways tonight more than once. Andrea, Saskia, comments on how people with true early onset, the unique issues that they face as opposed to late onset?
I'll let Saskia take this one.
Oops, and I realized I was muted there. Thank you. I think the only piece I could add to what Naomi just spoke about is that again the misconception about dementia is that it's an older person's disease, and so a lot of the services and programs are set up that way, and so the frustrations we hear from our clients, from people who have been diagnosed early. And, let's keep in mind the clinical cutoff for what is considered early or young onset versus, sporadic dementia is 65. We're not talking that old. Right. And even then, at that point, if you can't relate to the people who are in the room, who are there to provide your supports, it's really difficult. If your stories are different because you're trying to juggle exactly as you identified, Jay, you might still have kids in the house with you, and you still have a full-time job. And so this is where I talked a little bit about this earlier. Dementia cuts so many different boundaries. It crosses housing and transportation and work. I think it impacts people with young onset or early onset even more so, because they're still very much in those domains and trying to juggle all of those at the same time. And this is where the policies and the national dementia strategy can have a really key role, because it can create the type of support that goes beyond just health, but really addresses the broader spectrum of supports that you need with dementia.
Thank you for that. Here's an interesting question. How is technology being used to help those living with dementia and their caregivers? Would you like to take a shot?
Sorry, I got a bit cut off for a second. I think you called out on me, so I'm gonna take a shot at that. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So I do a bit of research in this area, and certainly there are a lot of interesting technologies that are being developed around, starting off with diagnosis, ways of identifying people who may be developing early signs of dementia, ways of tracking disease progression, and then also technologies that are really focused on cognitive rehab. But my real interest is on technology as a sort of assistive devices, right? Ways in which we can use technology to promote the inclusion and the participation of people living with dementia in their community, and find ways to maintain their function and their independence for as long as possible. And so assistive technology is one way we can do this. And assistive technology goes from like super low tech to super high tech. And so, it could be as simple as things like door alarms or grab rails or night lights, fall detectors, adapting technologies that we have already, like mobile phones, but making them easier so people with dementia can use them, because smartphones are not really designed for people to use easily. And then there are things that are about addressing memory loss. You can have things that give prompts and memory aids and object finders, where are my keys, being able to, track things down. And then you can get to things like locator devices to help with people with dementia who are wandering away from home or have their trouble finding their way home. Vision and hearing aids, like you mentioned earlier, right? So we have to find ways to make sure that everyone's sensory function is really well optimized if they're having trouble with their cognition. And then, then all the way to things like artificial intelligence and robotic technologies that, our people are looking into as ways. But I guess the key is that we really have to find technology that works for people, that's not burdensome or complicated or too expensive. And so that's really where there's a lot of research and effort being focused right now, ways to make the technology really relevant and really practical for people.
And I guess if we define technology quite broadly, even the sort of shape of a residence and the interactions that go on. I heard a great story about a grocery store, I think in a Dutch home for people with dementia, where one of the people living there would come in and try to pay for something with a handkerchief, and the cashier takes the handkerchief, fiddles around with the cash register, hands back the handkerchief as change, and everybody's happy, and it's unusual, but it reminds me too, and maybe Saskia, you could comment on this, that I've seen lots of kids, I would say, who first have to encounter the issue that a grandparent or even a parent has starting to get dementia, and they want correct answers, in a conversation, and they get impatient sometimes when their relative is not answering what they think is with the correct answer. Are there simple guidelines for caregivers or relatives or friends to be able to deal more effectively with somebody with dementia?
They are, and they're constantly evolving. And I'd say Naomi would probably be able to answer that more appropriately. But I'll bring up the concept of dementia-friendly communities, and it's something that people might have heard. It really is a global movement. In my previous role, I worked with the World Health Organization on the Global Dementia Unit. And dementia-friendly communities was one of the very first pieces that we focused on, because the concept behind it is that you can make any community safe and accessible for a person living with dementia. And in fact, if you make it safe and accessible for a person living with dementia, you're likely making it accessible for a whole range of other people who have other conditions and disabilities. And so, you mentioned the grocery store, but the concept behind dementia-friendly communities is that when everyone, from the bus driver to the grocery store clerk to the bank clerk, understands dementia, has a better education about it and communication skills with how to work with someone with dementia, you're able to enable that person and their caregiver to remain in the community and to be independent and engaged in the community. And ultimately, isn't that what we're talking about when we talk about social connectedness? So, the very quick example is if someone with dementia were to go into a grocery store and perhaps can't remember why they're there, or they have a list, but they might not be able to read that list. A grocery store clerk who understands dementia, recognizes some of those symptoms, could just be more patient and perhaps make some suggestions. Were you perhaps looking for the cheese? Can I help you with that? And being patient that way and communicating effectively that way could have helped the person to navigate and get what they need. So this is the concept behind dementia-friendly communities in terms of really educating the public and key people in the community to understand and be able to speak about dementia. But I'll turn it over to Naomi, whom I'm sure will have more to add.
I really love what you said. And I think things for Leonard and I really started to change when we went somewhere or went into a store or something, and this is with Leonard's permission, where we would be engaged in some sort of transactional thing. It's not going too well, and you can tell that it's deteriorating. I would just say, my husband has dementia, so maybe we can do this. And it would just change everything. People are kind. People don't necessarily know. And that's why there's such a need for just education, really just basic, without knowing all the different types of dementia and this and all that, just to say, just to sort of give a hand in a way. And I think there's a lot of training out there for caregivers and people that work with others with dementia. And to be honest, nothing works all the time. And as soon as you find a strategy that seems to kind of work, then it doesn't. And you have to, it's sort of like whack-a-mole. Then you have to re-strategize. Anybody out there who is in the position that we're in will understand that, and that's okay. And that there isn't, just like Dr. Weaver said, there's not going to be one pill you take and it's not going to fix everything. There isn't one technique of either communication or relationship or anything that's going to fix it all. But there are things that you start to get to know, and then you grow, you evolve, you change, and it's very individual actually. But I keep coming back to this point that we have to talk about it. It can't be completely invisible, where we are afraid to share it. We're afraid to learn about it, experiment with different things, and expect it not to feel more isolated and more frightened and more like it's not okay, because it's okay to be wherever we are. It's just sometimes difficult to figure it out, right? Like we've had to re-strategize a million things.
It's
Right.
true.
Right?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to do the TV thing of saying we have a minute left, but we do have a minute left. And I have one more question that I'd like to throw out to the panel, and we'll see who wants to answer it. It's already been Alzheimer's, or dementia generally, has already been referred to as a second pandemic that's happening alongside COVID. What is going to happen to increase funding to deal with it? And I'll just throw that out quickly.
Greater public awareness and education of the public. I think that with COVID, what we have seen is that people have seen the impact that it has on society. And I think that we need to be able to demonstrate the impact that dementia is having on our society, and that it's not a disease of older individuals. It's a disease that can affect younger individuals, and that the modification of risk factors starts at a very young age. And so since this is something across the full spectrum, I think that that is a message which, if we get out there, will acquire and encourage widespread interest. And with that, hopefully support will follow.
Thanks very much, Don. It's time for me to thank a number of people. Our panelists, Dr. Donald Weaver, Dr. Saskia Sivananthan, Dr. Andrea Iaboni, and if you don't mind me saying, especially Naomi and Leonard Howe. You guys are remarkable. Tonight's event was recorded, so if you registered, you'll receive a link to that recording. Link will also be available on the Krembil YouTube page. Big thank you, too, to the people behind the scenes, the whole Krembil team, for organizing and producing tonight's event, and the Alzheimer Society of Canada for partnership and assistance. And please know that help and resources are available through the Alzheimer Society. And if you want more information on the Krembil Brain Institute's research programs and services, here are the websites that you can go to. Be well, stay healthy, and from all of us here on the panel, good night.